Season 11 brought with it the new community-crafted game mode, featuring changes to every single character designed by some of your favorite content creators. And while pressing F1 in-game will give you a brief little description of what the changes are, it doesn't give you any exact numbers, and some things are completely left out of that description. So I figured I would make a quick video just to cover all of the different changes for people that might be interested. Starting with all of the tank hero changes, which were done by Emongg. For D.Va, her defense matrix now reduces incoming beam damage by 30%, and it now reduces the cooldown of micro missiles based on the amount of damage that you absorb with defense matrix. And D.Va's boosters, she can now strafe sideways and backwards while using them. For Doomfist, his hand cannon now has its projectile speed increased from 80 to 160. Power block, the required damage mitigation for rocket punch to get an empowered punch, has been reduced from 100 to 80. Seismic slam, the shockwave height has been increased from 1.45 to 1.75 meters. And meteor strike, the damage will now scale up the longer Doomfist is in the air. The base damage starts at 50% but scales up to 200% by the end of the ability duration. Next up, Junker Queen. Commanding Scout will now give her armor instead of overhealth, and Rampage has had its cast time reduced from 0.75 seconds to 0.375 seconds. Mauga has had his overrun changed. The radius of his stomp has been increased from 7 meters to 9 meters. The critical hit damage has been increased from 120 to 180 damage, and the critical hit radius has been increased from 2 meters to 3 meters. So yes, Mauga's Stomp can crit if you land exactly on top of someone, and now that critical will deal even more damage and be easier to hit. And yes, if you were curious, you do also get the overhealth from his crit passive when you land on someone with a critical stomp. Moving on to Orisa, she has a brand new ability, Halt, from Overwatch 1, which is now activated by pressing reload, and then can be detonated again by pressing reload. So now she just has another entire ability because they didn't replace Energy Javelin or Javelin Spin. But Energy Javelin has seen its cooldown increased from 6 seconds to 8 seconds, and Javelin Spin has seen its cooldown increased from 8 seconds to 12 seconds. For Ramatra, his Void Accelerator, the projectile size has been increased by 25%. Ravenous Vortex has had its height increased by 100%, and that is it for him. Yeah, he's not as interesting as the other two. Ravenous Vortex being really tall, I think should be something in the game though, because it should be good against flyers, and it's just not. For Reinhardt, his barrier field now gives him a movement speed bonus based on the amount of health that it is missing, up to a 50% increase in movement speed. Fire Strike has a buff that after hitting an enemy, Reinhardt will gain 30% increased movement speed for 2 seconds. And Charge will now give Reinhardt 50% damage reduction while charging. So very interesting changes for Reinhardt, in stark contrast to Ramatra. But Roadhog continues the trend with actually unique changes. Chain Hook will no longer pull the target towards Roadhog, it now pulls Roadhog towards the enemy or the environment that you hit, so you can kind of use it like Widowmaker's Grapple a little bit. Take a Breather has had its damage reduction reduced from 50% to 30%, and it will now give nearby allies a 10% damage reduction while it's being used. And Whole Hog will now pull in nearby allies towards Roadhog when it is activated. Sigma, his Experimental Barrier, has had its sealed health regeneration rate increased by 25%. Kinetic Grasp can now be cancelled by pressing the ability again, and absorbing damage with the ability will no longer provide overhealth, and instead it will reduce the cooldown of a Crescent. In addition, Gravitic Flux is now considered a transformation ultimate, meaning that it can no longer be interrupted by any stuns. For Winston, his Tesla Cannon secondary fire can now be charged up even further, beyond 1 second. You can continue charging it for up to another 2 seconds to increase the damage dealt to 150. And because of it, the overall channel time for the ability has been increased from 2.5 seconds to 4.5 seconds. Meaning 4.5 seconds is the maximum amount of time that you can be channeling it before it will just activate on its own. Winston's Bubble has had its size radius increased from 5 meters to 7 meters, and Primal Rage will now create and drop a projected barrier upon activation, and the primary melee attack range has been increased by 25%. And rounding out the tanks with Wrecking Ball. Pile Driver, Wrecking Ball will now get a free cast after impacting an enemy hero, which does not require being in the air. The free cast will expire if it's not used within 5 seconds. Minefield also got a change, with the mine radius size being increased by 50%. And lastly, Zarya, her projected barrier now also provides allies with 30% increased movement speed, and Graviton Surge will now destroy any incoming projectiles, and as well as Baptiste Immortality Field, because fuck Immortality Field, I guess. It deserves it. Next, we have the hit scan damage hero changes, which were done by TQQ. Starting with Ass, her dynamite can now be detonated by pressing the ability button again, as well as Bob can now be stopped manually by pressing the ultimate ability input again. Bastion has had a nuke strapped to his back and will now explode when killed, dealing 300 damage in a 5-meter radius. His recon configuration has had its damage reduced from 25 to 24, but the rate of fire has been increased from 5 to 6 shots per second. His A36 tactical grenade has been removed and replaced by self-repair on his secondary fire, and his assault configuration has had its damage reduced from 12 to 9, but it can now deal critical damage, whereas previously it could not. For changes with Cassidy, he has now stolen Kiriko Suzu and jammed it into his pocket. Combat Roll now launches you forward in whatever direction you are facing, and it also now cleanses negative status effects and heals for 50 health. And the distance has been increased by 50%. For Reaper, his Wraith form now acts like Moira's Fade ability. It can be also activated during Death Blossom, and it also deals 50 damage to enemies that you pass through. In addition, his passive, called the Reapening, which is what heals him, can now heal up to 50 additional overhealth. So even if you're at full health, dealing damage as Reaper will still give you some kind of benefit from his self-healing passive. Next up for Sojourn, her primary fire projectile speed has been increased from 150 to 300, and her primary fire damage has been reduced from 9 to 6. Power Slide will now only launch you forward in the direction that you are facing, but now it can travel upwards, so have fun with that. Soldier 76 has hit the gym, so his sprint now has a bonus movement speed increased from 50 to 80%. Biotic Field can now be thrown in your aimed direction, meaning that you can now chuck it at people if you want to, so you can toss your bro a soda if they're low. And Tactical Visor has been majorly buffed. While using the ultimate, his movement speed is increased by 20%, and it now grants unlimited ammo for its duration. Sombra has gotten a couple very random changes. Her Translocator projectile speed has been increased from 72 to 125, meaning she can now translocate a bit further away due to it traveling faster. And Stealth has been completely changed in the most bizarre way possible, so the detection radius for Sombra has been increased from 4 to 20 meters. The visual effects for the radius has been removed because it would just be way too big. However, now your player outline is hidden while you're in stealth, so Sombra will be slightly harder to notice while you are detected, and the bonus movement speed has been increased from 45% to 100% while you are in stealth. Tracer with some very unique changes. Her health has been reduced from 175 to 150. The spread on her pistols has been increased from 3.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees. Pulse Bomb has had its projectile speed increased from 15 to 100, so you can kind of just, snipe people with it now, I guess. Both her cooldowns have been reduced. Blink has had its cooldown reduced from 3 to 2.5 seconds, and Recall has its cooldown decreased from 13 to 10 seconds. For Widowmaker, her Venom Mine has had the projectile speed increased from 20 to 40 meters per second, and her Sniper Rifle has been changed. Scoped shots will now deal damage over a 1-second period as a damage over time, and critical hits deal damage in half the time, so only a half a second. Next up, we have the projectile damage hero changes, which were done by Custa. For Echo, Duplicate can now target allies, but if you do target an ally, then the ultimate rate multiplier that she gets while she is transformed is reduced from 450% to 350%. Genji's ultimate, Dragon Blade, has had its cast time reduced from 1 second to a half a second. His swing speed has been slowed from 0.7 seconds to 0.9 seconds, and it now heals Genji for 20% of damage done. Hanzo's Storm Arrow has been completely altered. He has mastered Jelking, and his recovery period after firing his bow has been reduced from 0.5 to 0.25 seconds. The draw time has been reduced from 0.7 to 0.2 seconds, but he now has a maximum ammo of 10 and must reload. And his maximum damage has been reduced from 120 to 70. His Storm Arrow ability has been replaced by Scatter Arrow, and the main arrow of Scatter Arrow has had its maximum impact damage increased from 120 to 130, and all of the arrows that split out of Scatter Arrow has had their damage reduced from 75 to 50. Junkrat has some very interesting changes. His Grenade Launcher has had its projectile speed increased from 25 to 35 meters per second, but his ultimate is very, very interesting. Riptire is no longer controlled in first person. Instead, it can be detonated by pressing the ultimate ability input again. The maximum duration of the ability has been reduced from 10 to 1.5 seconds. The movement speed of the tire has been increased by 100%. The maximum explosion damage has been reduced from 600 to 300 damage. The explosion radius has been reduced from 10 to 5 meters. And tire will now ignite enemies for 150 damage over 5 seconds if they do get hit by it. As for Mei, she gets the Frozone treatment. Her endothermic blaster, Frozen Ground, will now increase Mei's movement speed by 20%. And Blizzard has been changed so that the effect is now centered around Mei instead of her throwing out the little dude guy. Snowball, I think is his name. And it will now root enemies instead of just stunning them. Pharah has gotten a change to her rocket launcher. Direct impacts will now grant her 15 overhealth up to a maximum of 45 overhealth. And during her ultimate, she can now use both her jump jet and jump dash abilities while channeling her ultimate. Symmetra has decided she's never going to ask for consent ever again. A teleporter will now forcibly teleport players that stand on it, and the duration has been reduced from 10 to 5 seconds. Her sentry turrets have also been, so now they're more of just a laser trap. They will no longer track enemy targets and now just continuously fire a straight beam. The damage per second has been increased from 35 to 80, and the movement speed slowdown has been increased from 15% to 25%. Torbjorn with the coolest change because I missed the level 3 turret. Torbjorn's turret will now automatically upgrade to level 3 while his overload ability is active, which is very cool. I missed the level 3 turret. I'm glad it's back. Lastly, for Venture, their Tectonic Shock has had the maximum ability duration increased from 7 to 10 seconds, but now it has damage fall off starting from 150 maximum damage in front of Venture down to 110 minimum damage at the maximum possible range. And then lastly, for the support heroes, which the changes were done by Eskay, Ana has now committed crimes. I mean, she already committed crimes anyways in lore, but she has now committed theft and stolen Bab's exo boots, so now she just has them. Also, her rifle reload time has been reduced from 1.5 seconds to 0.75 seconds. For Baptiste, his exo boots will now grant him increased movement speed while in the air. So maybe he just got a new model and then gave the old ones to Ana. Maybe there's less crime going on. Ana is still like a war criminal though, so she ain't getting out easy. And that was all Baptiste got, just increased movement speed while in the air. For Brig, her sealed bass now grants Brigitte 30% movement speed for 2 seconds after the ability ends, and it no longer stops any current momentum when it ends. So you can kind of just yeet yourself if you jump off of high ground with it. And Inspire also got a change that they should probably just put into the live game immediately, but it now shows Brigitte's icon on your HUD when you are currently being healed by Inspire. That is actually pretty nice. I think it's cool. Next up for Illari, Healing Pylon now has 2 charges, but the healing has been reduced from 30 per shot to 20 per shot. And yes, that does mean that you can have 2 healing pylons out at the same time. For Lifeweaver, his Thorn Volley has had the damage per projectile increased from 6 to 7, and his weapon swap speed has been increased by 100%. Life Grip has had its cooldown reduced from 19 seconds to 15 seconds, and Pedal Platform now has 2 charges as well. In addition, the jump height boost that you get from jumping off the pedal while it's going up has been increased by 50%. And yes, 2 charges does mean that you can have 2 pedals out at the same time, just like with Illari Pylon. For Lucio, his primary fire, Sonic Amplifier, has had its damage per projectile increased from 18 to 22, and Sound Barrier will now provide more overhealth based on Lucio's fall time, scaling up to 100% bonus overhealth if he is falling for 1 or more seconds. For Kiriko, Swift Step can now be used when no ally is targeted. When used this way, you do a directional teleport and have a reduced cooldown of 50%. For Mercy, Guardian Angel has had its cooldown reduced from 1.5 seconds to 1 second. Resurrect with some very interesting changes. The cast time has been reduced from 1.75 seconds to 1 second. The cooldown has been reduced from 30 seconds to 18 seconds. However, now allies that are resurrected are only temporarily alive, and they will die after 10 seconds pass. In addition, Valkyrie will now reset your resurrect cooldown, so you can res and then Valk and then res again. For Moira, she got a new gamer chair, and Biotic Grasp is now able to deal critical damage to enemies while aiming directly at their head. And lastly, my favorite boy Zenyatta, Transcendence will now grant Zenyatta full flight so you can fly around with it and do whatever your heart desires, and his Snap Kick passive has been changed. Now, instead of knocking back enemies, now if Zenyatta hits the environment, he will knock himself back. So it's now, instead of a knock people away from you, it now lets him knock himself away from someone. So very cool. I think this will be a very fun game mode for a bit. And hopefully this is useful for some of the people that wanted to know the exact numbers behind some of these changes, because I didn't even put them in the patch notes. I actually found them and it's in a blog post instead. Meanwhile, the changes for the April Fool's event were actually placed in the patch notes, but these are kind of hidden away a little bit, so people might not be aware that these exist and only go off of the little blurbs that they give you when you press F1. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. See ya. Have fun in the new game mode.